Hi everyone, Paul Delaguardia here in Berlin. Yesterday I attended the Berlin Energy Forum organized by BNE Intellinews and Aris. There were a number of fantastic speakers, including Aris himself, Weafer of Macro Advisory, Christof Rühl, a well-known energy expert previously at the World Bank, and also, of course, my former colleague from the IAF and currently at the Kyiv School of Economics, Benjamin Hilgenstock. So it was great to catch up with everyone and meet some new faces, and especially to learn about all the sanctions pressure against Russia and the attempts to support Ukraine via the energy sector and energy sector sanctions and also financial sector sanctions. So far, energy sector sanctions are having mixed effects on Russia, but more can be done. On the financial side, the sanctions introduced in December, the secondary sanctions introduced by the US Treasury, are starting to bite Russia. Those are hurting, and that was a big topic during the recent Putin-Xi summit. The West missed its chance to really hurt the Russian economy in 2022 for various reasons. And Russia is in a very strong macroeconomic position right now. But this is coming at the expense of long-term growth, with the military-industrial complex using labor and resources at the expense of national development projects. And the big winners in this whole situation are Saudi Arabia and other oil exporting countries in the Gulf, in the Middle East. Back in 2022, immediately after the beginning of the war, as financial sector sanctions began to bite, that was really the opportunity to damage the Russian economy. The problem is that money continued to flow to Russia in exchange for oil and gas. So that really undermined the sanctions that had been put in place by the Western coalition. Putting money into an escrow account would have been one solution to significantly damage the Russian economy, but this wasn't done, and the reasons for that we'll get to later. Essentially, the West isn't really willing to undergo the economic pain necessary to fight this economic war with Russia. Meanwhile, in 2022, Nabulina responded brilliantly by raising interest rates very significantly, putting on capital controls and other forms of FX restrictions that shored up the ruble and the economy. Also, Russia has been preparing ever since the 2014 round of sanctions against Crimea for this eventuality, for the possibility of having to run a ghost fleet. So these ships didn't appear magically. This was prepared years in advance. Also diversification in pipeline routes from Siberia to China. And Saudi Arabia and OPEC are also playing a huge role here in setting global oil prices. And the currently high prices that have been running in the $80 to $90 per barrel range for the past several months are no accident. Keeping them rather high is exactly what Saudi production output is designed to do. This is greatly benefiting Russia and undermining the Western coalition's attempt to sanction the energy sector. The relevant sanctions actions are the crude oil price cap and embargo put into place in December 2022 by the US Treasury, and a few months later in February 2023, the same type of price cap and embargo on Russian oil products. The goal of these two measures was to keep Russian volumes flowing into the market to avoid disrupting global oil markets and seeing prices rise at the gas pump globally, while also hurting Russian revenues. These energy sanctions are partly working, but more action is needed. A further action that was taken was in the latter half of 2023 was the US Treasury designating Russia's shadow fleet for sanctioning as well. That had an impact initially, but then slowed as enforcement was rolled back in the early part of 2024. In 2023, the US Treasury implemented secondary sanctions on any financial institutions doing business with Russia that would somehow support its war efforts. So this is what's really having a major impact today. And these seem to be biting Russia quite hard at the moment and have been a major topic of the recent Putin-Xi summit in Beijing. So the point of these sanctions introduced in December 2022, February 2023, and later on in 2023 is to hurt the Russian economy. The only way that can work is that everyone involved in the Russian oil trade, especially the buyers, want to be compensated for taking the risk of finding themselves on the wrong end of an OFAC US Treasury sanctions action. To be clear, each $10 of discount on the price of Russian oil when it is sold causes about $20 billion in lost revenue to the Russian economy, if that's on an annualized basis. So there can be quite a large impact from these measures. Also, consider the fact that when India or China or Turkey gets a cheaper price on Russian oil that it's buying, it's essentially getting a subsidy to its industrial and manufacturing sectors that gives it a bit of a competitive advantage on the global marketplace. So this is something that is certainly not lost on the Kremlin and not lost on China and other emerging markets that are benefiting from this. So the discount on Russian oil rose initially in 2022 to around $30 to $35. That was mainly a geopolitical risk premium purely because Russian oil was seen as somewhat tainted, which of course it is. But then the discount went down as buyers found what they could get away with in the market. And so the discount was certainly at a lower level later on in 2022. But that discount, of course, rose again in December 2022 with the introduction of the US Treasury's new energy sanctions, the price cap and the embargo at the time. It's clear that this was more the embargo rather than a price cap working, because there was a discount on Ural crude that essentially would flow to Europe before. The discount never became as large on crude exported from Eastern Russia into China. Another reason why it's clear that the price cap didn't work and that it was the work of the embargo, in fact, is that if the price cap had worked, you would have seen price clustering around just under $60 a barrel, which was the threshold under which Russian oil should not have traded. In the summer of 2023, Russia mobilizes its shadow fleet, which consists of 40 or 41 vessels. Oil prices rose at this time, and that coincided with Russia's discount dropping, meaning the discount on its oil that buyers benefit from. So at that point, OFAC starts targeting the shadow fleet with new sanctions. So the discount starts rising once again through the end of 2023. But OFAC stops enforcing these sanctions on the shadow fleet for some reason, stops implementing them in early 2024. So the discount hasn't widened further this year. Brussels officials have said privately that by the time they sanction a vessel, the ship has already been renamed and the company has been re-registered, rendering their sanctions actions ineffective. There are three problems with energy sanctions against Russia. The first is violation. This is essentially what is called attestation fraud. So 29% of Russian oil touches G7 services somehow. So we would expect to see, based on that number, that 29% of Russian oil trades under $60 a barrel, which is the threshold of the price cap. But in fact, you only see about 2% of that oil trading under the threshold. So that means there's a very large amount of violation happening of the price cap. This makes sense because the buyers are no longer international oil traders from oil majors, but in fact it's suspected that they are the subsidiaries of Russian oil companies that have been registered in Dubai and in various countries around the world that are now buying this. So if that's true, of course it would make sense that they would lie about the actual price of that Russian oil that they're buying and trading on international markets. The second problem is evasion. Today, the shadow fleet is carrying around 80% of Russian crude and around half of all Russian oil products. These proportions are rising, and that is certainly a problem. The third problem, and the big one, is actually the unwillingness of the West to see Russian oil volumes be completely removed or somewhat removed from global oil markets. And it's clearly because this would cause a massive supply shock, and prices to rise at the pump. Saudi Arabia and other players would be able to bring pressure to bear on the situation as well. So of course, you can imagine that G7 taxpayers would be unlikely to accept this outcome and to pay such a steep price at the gas pump. As for the ghost tankers, the US has actually given India unofficial clearance to continue buying from Russia's ghost fleets, essentially illicitly. So it's an unofficial waiver of going around the United States official sanctions policy, clearly in order to avoid disrupting global oil markets and keep enough supply going around to keep prices stable. So why are these energy sanctions so ineffective? Well, essentially, look at the impact on Russia. Russia's government budget, oil export earnings, and budget oil revenues have not declined since the beginning of the war. There was an initial widening of the deficit from December 2022 to February 2023, when the energy sanctions were first implemented. This is also partly because Siluanov, the finance minister, was front-loading a lot of the expenditures to be sure to make end-of-year targets. By summer 2023, Russia had started getting revenues from its new oil exporting machine to India. It took a few months to put that into place, given the length of the round trip to send tankers from the Baltic Sea to India. By summer 2023, Russia had started getting oil revenues from its shipments to India and Asia. It took a few months to put that oil exporting machine into place because of the length of the journey around Europe and all the way to India. Russia's budget stayed on track in 2023. So far, 2024 year to date, budget revenues are up by 50%, while Russian government budget expenditures are only up by 20%. Within that, oil and gas revenues are up by 80%, and non-oil and gas revenues are up by a healthy 40%. And importantly, these revenues are internal and not subject or not at risk to Western sanctions. For the broader macro picture of Russia, there's little external debt vulnerability, even without its frozen assets that are held in Belgium, the EU, and elsewhere. Russia still has just about enough international reserves to completely pay off its external debt tomorrow if it wanted to. That external debt is around $326 billion. There's been quite a healthy spike in Russia's current account in March 2024. The reading for that month was $13 billion, which is much higher than what it was a year ago, which was $5 billion. These dynamics are evolving favorably for Russia. Industrial production is growing, with the Purchasing Managers Index above 50. Unemployment is down to around 3%. Wages are rising faster than inflation, though these are also symptoms of a longer-term demographic problem. Because of Russia's low birth rate, and because of the mobilization of labor and resources to the military-industrial complex, these resources and labor are no longer available to pursue other long-term national projects. So while this is a rosy picture for Russia in the short term, over the long term, economic growth could certainly suffer.